This is called cucumber gazpacho. And it's very easy to do if you have a blender. So, you know, you do this. You take your 4 cups of chopped cucumber, and my wife tells me that that's what this is. And you dump it in there. And then you put your celery and your dill in. And you put your 4th cup of lemon juice in. And your salt. I'll try not to spill this. And the water in. And where's the onions and the tomato?
They're already in the soup.
Oh, you're ahead of me. There. And if you're doing this after you blend it up, you put your tomatoes and your sweet onion in. But we did it this way because we wanted them to marinate. And then you put an avocado in. But you have to first blend it. I'm just getting it ready. And then we'll put it in. Because if you don't, then you get it so fine that my wife doesn't like it. And we don't want that. So, this is the technical thing right here. I think that's enough. That's my cooking. And then you take out the avocado. Now you can do it lots of ways, but being lazy, I take the avocado out with a spoon, like that. And you want to get the avocado closest to the skin because that's where it's deep green, and that's where the most antioxidants are, is that deep green. So get all of that goodness right next to the skin. It makes sense that nature would pack it that way because that's the part that oxidizes the soonest because it's close to the skin. There, that was better, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. I'm a quick study. All right, and then you just flip it on and blend it a little bit. Now you have your cucumber gazpacho, that easy. Tonight we're going to be talking about is your food sustainable, or are you eating like there's no tomorrow? Yeah, another way to put it is, what's the environmental impact of your diet? You know, we talk about environment a lot, and we're all worried about the transportation industry and cars and trucks and buses and planes and greenhouse gas emissions, except for in Washington they don't have greenhouse gases. They just have a lot of hot air. But nonetheless, we think about that a lot. And what I want you to understand is the most important contributor to environmental change is what we eat. Without question, it's what we eat. That has more of an impact on the earth than anything else that we do. It's the voting you do with your knife and fork. That has more to do with environmental degradation or rebuilding than any other human habit. And so I'd like to talk about sustainable food for just a moment, and then I want to go over some facts about diet and the environment to give you a sense of how important the choices you make are. So sustainable food, that as it's defined, is food that's nutrient dense. But if it's just nutrient dense and it's not affordable, it doesn't do anybody any good. So sustainable food should be nutrient dense, affordable, culturally acceptable, because if it's not culturally acceptable, who's going to eat it? Who wants to eat that? You know. So it's got to be culturally acceptable. And lastly, sparing of the environment. So let's look at each of those. nutrient dense. What does that mean? Well, it means it has a lot of nutrients, as in vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, particularly the polyphenolic antioxidants. The soup that you just had is really rich in polyphenolic antioxidants. It has the allium family in it. That's onions, and that's a rich source of the sulfur-containing antioxidants. It has the green in it from both the avocado and from the dill, and those are another source of a different type of antioxidant. It's got the red from the tomato, and those are the anthocyanins and the lycopenes, and you know, it's got the lemon, and they're a rich source of antioxidants too. So it's really nutrient dense, and it's relatively low calorie. The problem is most of our food today is high calorie and low nutrient. And if we want health, and if we want something sustainable, it needs to be high nutrient density and high in antioxidants, high in vitamins, high in minerals, and high in fiber, but relatively low in calories. Now, it also needs to be affordable, and not only affordable in terms of the initial purchase. I mean, if you can't afford to eat the food in the first place, what good is it, no matter how good it is for you? So it has to be affordable to purchase, but in addition, you want the downstream effects of that food to be affordable. What's that? Well, that's health care. If you eat really cheap food that makes you sick, that's not affordable, is it? In the long-term thing. And so we think of affordability, and that brings us back to nutrient density, because we want our food to be very nutrient dense so that we have the best of health. Because we know if it's very nutrient dense, we're going to have lower risk of cancer, lower risk of heart disease, lower risk, and if we have those diseases and the food is very nutrient dense, then there'll be some degree of reversibility to those diseases, because of course the body wants to heal itself. And so choosing a diet, regardless of what your health status is, whether you're in great health or whether you're battling cancer or heart disease, whatever, choosing a nutrient-dense food is very important. It should be culturally acceptable. And as I mentioned, that's food that people will eat. But remember, culture changes. And we've seen that in this area since Lynn and I first arrived 30 years ago. When we first started holding classes, people thought we were really kooky. They probably still do, I don't know. But, you know, a vegetarian? Vegan, what's that? And now it's, you know, everybody talks about it. And most of my patients, even if they're eating a standard American diet, they all say, I know I should be eating better. And what's better? Well, more plants. And no one argues with that anymore. Why? Because there's been a sea change in America, not just in this area. We all know now that we should be eating more plants, and we should be eating less sugar and less oil. Culture has shifted in the last 30 years. So even if it's not culturally acceptable initially, you know, we can all learn a bit, right? And that's why you're here, is to learn a bit. And lastly, sustainable food should be sparing of the environment. And when we talk about sparing of the environment, we're talking about food that, when grown, uses the least land, the least water, food that when grown improves the soil instead of degrading the soil, and produces little or no greenhouse gas emissions. All of those are important. And lastly, it should also require low consumption of energy for cultivation or feeding, and harvesting, and storage, and transport. Because all of those things play into the environmental cost of our food. if you eat an apple grown here in Maine, that's going to have a lower environmental impact than if you eat an apple grown in New Zealand. Now, apples from New Zealand taste really good, and I like you to buy them from there because my wife has family in New Zealand that grow fruit. But you can understand that the environmental cost of putting that fruit on an airplane and shipping it here is going to be much higher than if you bought it down the street. And so that's why we talk about local food. And when we talk about sustainable food, we can't not mention local grown too, because that has an environmental impact. Now let's just take a step back and look at that affordable cost of sustainable food from a healthcare perspective. This year, 2018, it's estimated that we will spend $3.5 trillion on healthcare in this country, not worldwide, in this country, $3.5 trillion on health care. That works out to about $10,700 for each of us a year. Okay? But according to the best estimates, 75% of cancer, 85 to 90% of heart disease, 80 to 90% of diabetes type 2, and get this, 90% of Alzheimer's disease could be prevented with just three lifestyle changes. You heard me, 90% of Alzheimer's, and I didn't know this until recently. I suspected it, but now we've got good data on it. Could be prevented with 3 things. That's all, just 3. 1, smoking cessation. Smoking is responsible for 40% of cancer and about 30% of heart disease, right there. Okay? So smoking cessation. 2, adopting a plant-based whole food diet. Not just a plant-based diet, not just a vegetarian diet, not just a vegan diet, because you can be a vegan and eat trash. Okay? And I would rather you be on an omnivore diet, eating some meat that was thoughtful, than to be a vegan and be unthoughtful. Okay? Because you can be on a vegan diet and eat trash. You can eat, you can be drinking soda every day. That's vegan. And that's worse for you than a beefsteak. You heard me say it. Sugar is in high concentration is probably the worst thing in the American diet. So I would rather you be a thoughtful omnivore than an unthoughtful vegan. But a plant-based whole food diet is the diet that will reverse disease the best. There's no question about that. And the third thing, of course, is exercise. That's it. 3 things, and you could cut healthcare costs an estimated $1 trillion. That's amazing. Within 5 years, you could cut those costs. Initially, you'd have some problem because you'd have what the people did last year and yesterday. But over 5 years, despite we're seeing increases every year, if everyone in America did those 3 things, we could expect about $1 trillion saving. And that's, that's real money, isn't it? $1 trillion. I could do something with that, I'm sure. I could give a lot away anyway. All right, so I want to go over a few statistics with you about the environmental consequences of your dietary choices. And you can stop me at any time and ask questions or say, I don't believe it. If you look up data on environment and diet, you'll find a wide range of statistics. And what I've tried to do is choose conservative numbers. When I see a high and a low, I'll try to go for the middle, or I'll go on the low end if it doesn't pass the credibility test. And the first one that I give you, I'll give you an example of that. 30% of greenhouse production comes from the raising of animals for human consumption. Now, 30% is more than the entire transportation industry. Now, what's the range there? I've seen as low as 20% and as high as 51%. So I chose, you know, sort of on the low end, 30%, but that's still more than all the trucks and all the cars and all the buses and all the airplanes. 30% of greenhouse gas comes from the raising of animals for human consumption. The average cow produces more greenhouse gas than the average SUV. It does that by belching and passing gas the other way, and also the food that it consumes, and etc. 30%. If you wanted to make an impact on global warming, if you believe there's such a thing, and some people don't, but if you wanted to make an impact, if you just got everyone to cut down on their meat production, their meat consumption, you'd make the biggest impact. If everyone stopped eating particularly cows and sheep, which are the worst, those two, you would easily meet the 2-degree centigrade target, and by reducing greenhouse gases. There's no other thing that we could do that with that easily. It's hard to do without cars, much harder to do without cars and trucks and buses and trains and planes than it is to do without meat. So some people would disagree with that, but you can still live pretty easily without that. All right, so here's another one on greenhouse gas. 20 servings of vegetables have fewer greenhouse gas emissions than 1 serving of beef. That's a huge difference, isn't it? You can sit down and have 20 servings of potatoes, and there'll be less environmental consequence than 1 serving of beef. That got my attention. All right, but not all vegetables produce the same amount of greenhouse gas. Here's one that you might not know about. Among cereal grains, rice has 5 times the emissions, that's greenhouse gas emissions, per gram of protein as wheat. Why is that? Because rice is grown in rice paddies, and rice paddies cover up vegetable material that then releases methane, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. So if you're wanting to eat environmentally sound, I'm not going to say you'll exclude rice, but you might concentrate on some of the other grains that are not grown in water in that fashion, like barley or wheat or quinoa, although there are other environmental impacts from quinoa, or oats. They're a great one. Oats are really good for the soil, and they're often grown for a crop rotation to improve soil. And corn, it gets a bad name, but it's much more environmentally friendly, except perhaps if you get into the GMO issues, than rice is, because of the methane released with the growing of rice. Here's another one, not on greenhouse gas, but let's shift from gas to the use of water. Water is the most valuable thing we have as far as commodity, other than the air we breathe. We've got to have air and we've got to have water. You may not be aware of it, but 70% of water consumption in the world today is used in the production of food. 70% of the water that we use on planet Earth every year is used in agriculture. And so it's really important for us to think, as we're looking ahead and seeing, well, we got more people coming and we don't have more Earth coming. You know, there's limited here. We want to think, how are we using our water? What's the best way to use our water? because we don't want to eat like there's no tomorrow, or there'll be no tomorrow. Okay? So here's some statistics on water. The average amount of water used to grow a day's worth of food for a vegan is 300 gallons. Now that's a lot of water, isn't it? 300 gallons. You thought you took a long shower. Well, 300 gallons would be a really long shower, but that's about how much water it takes to raise food for someone on a strictly plant-based diet. But someone that's on a standard American diet, guess how many gallons of water that diet requires a day? Any guesses? She says twice. Higher. 4,200 gallons. More than 10 times as much water is required to raise the food for someone on a standard American diet as on a vegan diet. So you can see immediately, if there's a shortage of water, we need to think about what we're eating. Okay? Here's another way to look at this same thing. It takes 12,000 gallons of water to raise 10 pounds of beef. You heard me. 12,000 gallons of water to raise 10 pounds of beef. Well, how much is 12,000 gallons? 12,000 gallons of water is enough to provide for all the domestic needs of the average family of 4 for a year. So now we're looking at the environmental cost of 10 pounds of beef. It's pretty high, isn't it? Not only in greenhouse gas, but in water usage. And if you want the references for some of these, I do have the references to back these up. So let's look at another one on energy, not water, but energy. It takes an average, see, when we grow food, it takes energy. You have to put energy in to get calories out, right? Now, if you're growing your own garden, you know that, because you have to go out there, and if you don't have a tractor that digs up, or a rototiller that digs up your soil, who digs it up? You do, right? Guess what? You are much more energy efficient than your car or a tractor ever thought of being. You can walk 50 miles on the calories in 1 pound of fat. You can't drive your car that far on 1 pound of gas, can you? No. So the most energy efficient way to provide food for yourself is to grow your own, right? But today, in the way we grow food, it takes about 3 calories of energy expenditure to grow 1 calorie of food. So you have to burn oil, because you transport half the energy, well, not quite half, about 35% of the energy related to your food production is getting it from where it's grown to your table, and then you've got some more that you have to use energy to refrigerate it or to cook it. So you've got energy there that's going on. But all told, it takes about 3 calories of energy on average to bring 1 calorie of food to your lips. But with beef, it takes 35 calories to bring 1 calorie of beef to your lips. So 10 times plus, right? So you look at the environmental cost of that. Pretty high, isn't it? 35 calories to give you 1 calorie of food. And of course those calories, that's a unit of energy, and we're talking about the burning of fossil fuels primarily, to run the tractor, to run the truck, to heat it up, to fry it, or to broil it, to store it. It has to be refrigerated the whole way, right? You don't, or dried or something to keep it so you can eat it. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind is the average food item in America travels 1,500 miles from where it's grown to where it's eaten. The average distance is 1,500 miles. You might be interested to know that 90% of the vegetables and fruits grown in America are grown in one place, the San Joaquin Valley in California. 90%. And to get them here costs money. Gas, diesel, refrigeration, okay? So that's part of it. But the average food travels 1,500 miles before it's consumed. In total, the average American requires 2,000 liters of oil. That's like 2,000 quarts, a little more, in oil equivalents to supply their yearly food. So you burn about 2,000 quarts of oil just to raise your food, if you're on a standard American diet. But if you're on a plant-based diet, you burn much less than that, and we'll talk about how much that is. Now, to put that more in perspective, here's a little interesting illustration. The average American consumes about 209 pounds of meat a year. Okay, so they eat their body's weight and then some in meat every year, the average American. Producing one hamburger, that's 1/4 pound, uses the same amount of fuel as driving your car for 20 miles. So if you eat a 1/4 pounder burger, that required the same amount of fossil fuel to grow that cow, to slaughter that cow, to refrigerate and transport that meat, and to refrigerate it in your own home and then to cook it, as driving your car 20 miles. That would mean a total of 80 miles for 1 pound, right? 20 times 4. To put that into context, the American meat consumer expends the same amount of fossil fuel annually eating meat as they would driving 16,720 miles, or 6 times across the country and back. Is it worth it to eat that meat? Well, it makes you think, doesn't it? That's a lot of fossil fuel burned for that 209 pounds of meat. All right, now let's look at land use, because we have more people coming, but we don't have more land being made. As Will Rogers said, investing in land is always a good investment because they don't make much more of it. And that's true in agriculture too. Unfortunately, much of the best agricultural land in the world is now under pavement and under houses. The whole LA basin, where LA and all those cities are, was the best agricultural land in the world. And they paved it. If you don't believe it, just fly over it sometimes. It just paved from one end to the other. So 2.6 acres of land is needed to raise food for one person on a standard American diet. 2.6 acres, that's about the size of 2 football fields. So if you're on an average standard American diet, it takes about 2.6 acres. That same land would grow food for 14 vegans. That's a huge difference. 14 people could eat off of that same 2.6 acres. Raising food for someone on a standard American diet produces more than twice as much of carbon dioxide as a vegan. 7.2 kilograms per day versus 2.9 kilograms a day. And that's to say nothing of methane or nitric oxide. Let's look at the land and water again, though. And this is from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition a few years ago. To feed a person eating a standard American diet requires 17 times more land, 14 times more water, and 10 times more energy than a person eating a vegetarian diet. That's not a vegan diet, that's a vegetarian. That means eggs and milk. It's even more marked if you compare it to a vegan diet. The best article looking at all of the various diets was actually published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition last year. And it shows that the environmental impact of a standard Western diet, in this case a European diet, is about 10 times what a person on a plant-based diet is. That's all environmental impact combined. All right, here's another one for us. If everyone in the world switched to a standard American diet, ate like we do, it would take more than 2 worlds to feed us all. But if everyone in the world switched to a plant-based diet, we could retire 5 billion acres of arable land to forests. Now, there are only 8 billion acres of arable land in the world. There are many more acres than that in agricultural production, grazing, etc. But if you just look at arable, that means plowable land. There are about 8 billion acres. Now, you can go online and you'll find lots of variation in what that actually is. But the best estimates of actual plowable land that's fertile enough without lots of added chemicals to grow good crops, it's about 8 billion. And if everyone in the world switched to a plant-based diet, we could retire 5 billion of those acres. Would we have room for population growth then? Well, yeah, because we'd be using less than half our land. That's really amazing to me. All right, food and water shortages underlie most of the armed conflicts in the world. Are you aware of that? What we're seeing in Syria and in Israel and in Palestine and in much of North Africa is because of water shortages. And the reason Israel is expanding a little bit and looking for those it's all about water. Because no water, no existence. And so if we shift what we're eating and we can save water, then we have more room for everyone. Very important to keep in mind. In the period from 1993 to 2013, the demand for animal products increased by 62%. That is, in those years, from 93 to 2013, people started consuming more meat, 62% more. That's a huge change. Now you say, well, that's because we have more population. No, in that same time period, the population increased by 29%. So what really happened is our demand doubled for animal products. It doubled faster, twice as fast as population growth. Here's another one that's interesting to you, and perhaps it was to me. Each minute, every minute of the day, each minute, there are 19,000 land animals in this country and over 100,000 worldwide that are killed for human consumption. Okay? You got that? 100,000 animals worldwide killed every minute for human consumption. Which means in the time we're going to spend here this evening, about an hour, that in this country, 1.14 million animals will be slaughtered for human consumption, and over 6 million worldwide in 1 hour. That's a lot of slaughtering. And every hour, there are 150 to 200 million fish that are caught and die for human consumption. Now, I want to level with you and tell you that I think it's much better if you're hungry for a fish to die than for you both to starve, right? Because we understand that a human life is worth more than an ant, and that a human baby's life is worth more than a fish. We understand that. But when we start thinking about this in terms of human life, and what's the cost to the environment, and what's the cost to someone else's ability to live, that's a different thing, isn't it? It's food production. You know, the way I'm producing my food, does that limit what other people have availability to? That's, for me, where the rubber meets the road. Sometimes we speak of overpopulation on the earth and decry the burgeoning millions in the third world. But in reality, we do not have too many people on the earth. We just have too many of us that are eating a standard American diet, right? That's how it is. In March of this year, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, there was an article published, and in that article they estimated that if everyone in this country today switched to a plant-based diet, we would have enough excess food that we could feed another 350 million people with no expansion of the cropland. That would go a long way to solving world hunger, wouldn't it? Now, that estimate was very conservative. If you look, you will see estimates anywhere from a low of 350 million to as high as 1.4 billion people that could be fed from the land in this country if we were all eating a plant-based diet. But remember, that plant-based diet is also the diet that would give us the greatest health. So you start thinking, what's good for the soil is good for the people, is good for the world in general. And I think it's important to think on those terms. And some people say, well, but you know, what I eat's a really personal thing. This is the way my parents ate. This is the way my grandparents ate. This is the way we do it in Maine, or, you know, whatever. But I would point out to you that what you eat is very personal, but having anything to eat or any water to drink is also a very personal issue. And I just want you to think about that next time you pick up your fork and your knife. Currently, there are 7.6 billion people on the earth. There are some 795 million of those people that are not getting enough food to eat. So 795 million are impoverished. Their brains aren't developing well because they're not getting enough calories. The children go to bed hungry at night. This is data from the UN organization, Food and Agricultural Organization. It's called the FAO. About 1 in 9 people on the earth are hungry. The vast majority of the world's hungry people live in developing countries where 12.9% of the population is undernourished. And that doesn't need to be that way. If you're going to eat beef, buy it locally. Then you don't have to truck it from all the way across the country, and chances are it will be more grass-fed and it'll have a lower environmental impact than if you bought it from Argentina or the Amazon, where they're cutting down rainforests to grow more cows, to raise more beef for McDonald's or some other burger joint. Okay? So eat locally whenever possible. This avoids the environmental costs of transportation. Number 2, avoid food wastage. The production of wasted food uses around 1.4 billion hectares of land. Now, if you want to know how many acres that is, just multiply it by 2.4. So we're talking almost a third of the arable land. In fact, we are. It's about 28% of the arable land. You raise the crop on it, and then it's wasted. And you know, I was thinking about this when I was preparing this lecture, and we have a compost pile. And you know, we compost our things, we put them back. But I thought, I wonder how much food goes into that compost pile just because I bought it without thinking and I didn't get around to eating it. That's wasted food. And it's amazing. 28% of the world's agricultural area is used to raise food that's wasted. And more than the amount of water that's used is staggering as well. More than 38 times the water footprint of U.S. households is used to raise food that's wasted. So you think of all the households in the United States and all the water that they consume, washing their clothes, washing their cars, washing themselves, drinking, preparing their foods. 38 times that amount is used to raise food that's wasted. That's incredible. So even if you don't change your diet, if you work on avoiding food wastage, you're going to really make a big difference, because a third of food is wasted. Don't be one of those. Here's another one. Avoid eating excess calories. Don't want to cut too close here, but the FDA recommends that the average American male eat 2,100 calories a day. And the average American male eats 3,641 calories a day. That does not contribute to his health, but is food wastage, right? Yeah. So if we eat what we need and not what we want, we can do more than you can imagine to deal with the problem of the environmental cost of dietary change. Even if you don't switch what you're eating, if you just eat sufficient. Okay, another one. Grow as much of your own food as you can. You say, well, I live in an apartment. Well, okay, how about a container garden? If you grow tomatoes and you get 5 pounds of tomatoes, that's 5 pounds that didn't have to get shipped from the Central Valley of California to here. You're saving energy. Grow something. It's the best thing you can do. Grow your own. Try edible landscaping, or as I mentioned, try growing in containers if you don't have a garden. If you do have a front lawn, you're using water on that, dig up a patch and put in a nice edible landscape. And if you don't get around to eating it, the deer will, and they'll enjoy it. Yeah, so grow your own. That's one of the simplest things that you can do, because you're not going to have a big tractor roaring around on your front lawn. You're going to use your own muscles. And gardening is the best exercise there is. You use all the muscles. And lastly, choose to eat and live simply, so that others may simply eat and live. I just think we all need to be thoughtful about our dietary choices and these simple things that even if you don't change your diet are so very, very important.